Guys, your subscription will really help in promoting my channel, and this will motivate me to improve content. If you like the video, you can subscribe to the channel and rate the video, thus helping me and my channel a lot. Thank you for understanding. The quiet town of Millfield in Indiana had never experienced anything like it before. The news of a series of murders connected to an online platform had spread like wildfire, causing panic and fear throughout the community. The victims, all young and vulnerable, had been lured to their deaths by a diabolical killer named Robert Johnson. The case of Johnson and his appalling crimes would later become known as the online killer. It all began the summer of 2018 when a young couple, Sarah and Michael, responded to an online job advertisement. They were thrilled at the prospect of finding work and starting their new life together. The job posting was for a house cleaning position at a local inn, and the pay was attractive. The couple eagerly contacted the poster, a man named Robert Johnson, and arranged to meet him at the inn. As they arrived at the location, they were met by a tall, lean man with a sinister smirk on his face. He introduced himself as Robert and gave them a tour of the inn. Everything seemed normal until they reached the back of the building, where there was a small room with no windows. Suddenly, Robert pulled out a gun and demanded that the couple hand over all of their money. In a moment of panic, Michael attempted to disarm Robert, but he was too quick and shot him in the chest. Sarah screamed in terror as Robert turned the gun on her and pulled the trigger. The police were called to the scene shortly after, and they were horrified by what they saw. The lifeless bodies of the couple lay in a pool of blood, and the inn room was in disarray. It was evident that the killer had taken their money and fled. The case went cold for a few weeks until another body was discovered in a similar manner. The victim, a young woman searching for a place to live, had responded to an advertisement online. She was lured to a remote location, where she was brutally murdered. The authorities soon realized that they were dealing with a serial killer who used online platforms to lure his victims. The investigation into the online killer was one of the most extensive in Indiana's history. The police scoured the internet, looking for any leads or clues that could help them identify the killer. They went through hundreds of ads and contacted anyone who had posted an advertisement connected to the case. Finally, with some luck, the police were able to track down Robert Johnson and his accomplices. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and they were apprehended and charged with 10 counts of murder. The trial was one of the most high-profile cases in Indiana's history, and the whole nation watched as the gruesome details of the online killer's crimes were revealed. In the end, Robert Johnson was sentenced to 10 life sentences, ensuring that he would never see the light of day again. The case had a profound impact on the community, and the people of Millfield pledged to never forget the victims of the online killer. The tragedy also led to more stringent security measures on online platforms, ensuring that buyers and sellers could meet securely and without fear of violence. Years have passed since the online killer was caught, but the memory of his crimes still haunts the people of Millfield. They remember the victims and grieve their loss, but they also celebrate the strength and resilience of their community. The online killer may have left a dark stain on their town, but he could not break their spirit. My opinion? The story of the online killer underscores the dangers of online interactions and emphasizes the significance of being vigilant when interacting with strangers online. It also highlights the importance of law enforcement and the justice system in safeguarding society from those who would seek to do harm. In the bustling city of Los Angeles, California, a young man named John had just turned 21 and was ready to embark on a new chapter in his life. He had recently graduated from college with a degree in business and was excited to start his own company. John had always been fascinated with scooters and had been searching for the perfect one to buy. He had scoured the internet and finally found one on Craigslist that caught his eye. The seller seemed genuine, and they quickly set up a meeting to finalize the purchase. On the day of the meeting, John arrived at the agreed-upon location, a quiet park near his home. He spotted the seller, a middle-aged man with a friendly smile, and approached him. The man introduced himself as Jack and showed John the scooter. It was just what John had been looking for, and he was eager to seal the deal. As they were finalizing the transaction, Jack suddenly pulled out a knife and demanded that John hand over all his money and valuables. John was taken aback, and he knew he had to act fast. He refused to give in to Jack's demands and fought back. In the struggle that ensued, John was stabbed several times in the chest and abdomen. He was bleeding profusely and knew that he was in serious trouble. Jack tried to flee the scene, but a group of bystanders had heard the commotion and called the police. By the time the authorities arrived, John was lying unconscious on the ground. They quickly assessed his injuries and rushed him to the nearest hospital. The doctors did everything they could to save him, but his injuries were too severe, and he passed away a few hours later. The news of John's tragic death spread quickly through the city, and people were outraged. The police launched an investigation, and with the help of eyewitnesses, were able to track down Jack, the perpetrator. Jack was arrested and charged with murder. He claimed that he was just trying to rob John and had not meant to kill him, but his defense fell on deaf ears. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. John's family and friends were devastated by his death, but they were determined to ensure that his legacy lived on. They started a foundation in his name to support young entrepreneurs and help them realize their dreams. In the end, John's tragic death brought the community together and sparked a conversation about the importance of safety when conducting online transactions. It served as a reminder that we must always be vigilant and take precautions to protect ourselves, even in seemingly harmless situations. My opinion: John's story is very tragic because his life was just beginning. He wanted to start a new chapter of life by creating his own business, but fate decided otherwise. I think John did the right thing in not standing still, although if he had tried to run away, it would have probably ended less tragically. In 2020 Florida, the sun shone bright on the young man as he posted an ad on Craigslist to sell his motorcycle. He had saved up for months to buy it, and now he was ready to let it go to make some extra cash. The response was quick, and a buyer contacted him, expressing interest in seeing the bike. The young man agreed to meet him at a nearby parking lot, eager to make the sale. The day of the meeting, the young man arrived at the parking lot and waited for the buyer to show up. He had a feeling that something was off, but he brushed it aside, thinking it was just his nerves. Finally, a group of men pulled up in a car, and one of them approached him, introducing himself as the buyer. The young man handed over the keys to the motorcycle, and the buyer hopped on to take it for a test ride. As the young man watched him ride away, he had a sinking feeling in his stomach. Something was not right. Moments later, the buyer returned, but this time he was not alone. A group of men, armed with guns, stepped out of the car and surrounded the young man. They demanded he hand over his phone, wallet, and the keys to the motorcycle. The young man was terrified and did as he was told, hoping they would leave him alone. But the assailants were not satisfied. They attacked the young man, beating him mercilessly and leaving him lying on the ground, bleeding and injured. They took off with his motorcycle, leaving him alone and helpless. The young man was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent several surgeries to repair the damage done to his body. But it was too late. He had suffered a spinal cord injury, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. His life would never be the same again. The assailants were eventually caught and convicted, but that did little to ease the young man's pain. He had lost his ability to walk, his independence, and his sense of security. He was forced to adapt to a new way of life, one that was filled with challenges and obstacles. The young man's story was shared across the country, and he became a symbol of hope and perseverance. People from all walks of life were touched by his story and inspired by his strength. In the end, The young man realized that while he may have lost the ability to walk, he had gained something much more valuable: a new purpose in life, and the knowledge that he was capable of overcoming even the toughest of challenges. My opinion: this story teaches us to never give up. We see from the example of a young man that even though he is now tied to a wheelchair, he still maintains a positive attitude. It was a hot and humid day in 2021 in the state of Illinois, and a woman named Maria was looking for a cheap watch band for her wristwatch. She had browsed through various online platforms, but found the prices to be too high. Finally, she stumbled upon a Craigslist ad that seemed promising. It advertised a watch band for a very reasonable price. Maria contacted the seller, and they agreed to meet at a nearby park. As Maria made her way to the park, she felt a little uneasy. She had never bought anything from Craigslist before and was meeting a complete stranger. However, she shrugged it off and assumed everything would be fine. She arrived at the park and looked around for the seller. After a few minutes, a man approached her and introduced himself as the seller. He appeared friendly and greeted her with a smile. However, as soon as they began negotiating the price, his demeanor changed. He became aggressive and demanded more money than what they had initially agreed upon. Maria tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't budge. In fact, he became physically aggressive, grabbing her wrist and pushing her against a tree. Maria was shocked and scared. She had never experienced anything like this before. She tried to scream for help, but he covered her mouth with his hand. Maria realized she had to do something and decided to fight back. The struggle was intense, and Maria sustained multiple tears in her clothes and on her skin. However, she managed to break free and run away. She called the police and reported the incident, giving them the description of the seller. The police arrived promptly and searched the area. They found the man hiding behind a tree and arrested him. The perpetrator was charged with assault and battery and went to trial. The evidence presented against him was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Maria was relieved that justice had been served. However, the incident had left her traumatized. She suffered from anxiety and nightmares for several weeks after the incident. She had trusted a stranger and had been assaulted. Maria realized that she had to be more careful in the future and never take her safety for granted. In the end, Maria learned a valuable lesson. She learned that there are people in the world who cannot be trusted and that one must always be cautious. She also learned that it's essential to fight back and never give up in the face of danger. Maria's experience is a reminder to all of us that safety should always be a top priority, and we should never compromise it for anything. My opinion: the story highlights the importance of being cautious when dealing with strangers, especially when it involves meeting them in person. It also teaches us to be prepared to fight back in case of any assault or danger. Ultimately, it emphasizes the significance of prioritizing our safety above anything else. In 2019, the people of New York City were shocked by a brutal crime that shook the entire city. It was a cold winter evening when a young woman decided to sell her cell phone through Craigslist. She had no idea that this simple transaction would end in tragedy. The woman had made an appointment with a potential buyer and went to meet him at the designated location. However, what followed next was something that nobody could have ever imagined. The perpetrator of this heinous crime was a man named John. He was a 35-year-old man who had a history of violence and had spent several years in prison for assault and robbery. He was known to the police as a repeat offender and had been in and out of jail for most of his adult life. John had a troubled childhood, and he grew up in a broken home. His father was an alcoholic who used to beat his mother, and John had to endure the violence and abuse as a child. As a result, he had a deep-seated anger and resentment towards society. On the day of the crime, John had responded to the woman's Craigslist ad and had made an appointment to meet her. He had no intention of buying the phone, and his only motive was to rob her. When the woman arrived at the meeting place, John attacked her with a knife and killed her. He took the phone and cash and fled the scene. The murder sent shockwaves through the city, and the police launched a massive manhunt to catch the killer. The detectives worked tirelessly to gather evidence and track down the perpetrator. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed surveillance footage, and analyzed the crime scene. Finally, after several days of investigation, the police were able to identify John as the prime suspect. He was arrested and charged with murder, robbery, and assault. The trial was long and grueling, and John's defense team tried their best to prove his innocence. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty on all charges. John was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The murder of the young woman was a tragedy that left a permanent scar on the city. Her family and friends were devastated by the loss, and the community was left reeling. However, justice was served, and the killer was brought to justice. John's life was ruined by his own actions, and he will spend the rest of his days behind bars. The incident serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of meeting strangers online and conducting transactions with them. It is important to take precautions and ensure your safety when dealing with unknown individuals. The incident also highlights the need for greater awareness about the impact of violence and the importance of seeking help for those who may be at risk of committing such crimes. The tragedy of the young woman's death is a stark reminder of the need for greater compassion and understanding in our society. My opinion? The story above highlights the importance of being cautious and taking necessary safety measures when dealing with unknown individuals, especially when conducting online transactions. It also emphasizes the devastating consequences of violent behavior and the need for greater awareness and support for those who may be at risk of committing such crimes. It was a sunny afternoon in 2016 in the state of Oregon, and a young man named Jack was looking for a bicycle to commute to work. He had searched for weeks, but couldn't find anything that fit his budget. Finally, he stumbled upon a Craigslist ad that advertised a bicycle for a very reasonable price. Jack contacted the seller, and they agreed to meet in a park. As Jack arrived at the park, he saw two men waiting for him. They introduced themselves as the sellers and invited him to inspect the bicycle. Jack was pleased with the bike and offered to buy it. However, as soon as he handed over the cash, the men attacked him. The two men punched Jack in the face and kicked him in the ribs, demanding his wallet and phone. Jack tried to fight back, but the men were too strong. They continued to beat him until he was barely conscious. They took his wallet and phone and left him lying on the ground. After a few minutes, Jack regained consciousness and realized what had happened. He managed to call the police and report the incident, giving them the description of the attackers. The police arrived promptly and searched the area. They found the two men hiding behind a tree and arrested them. The perpetrators were identified as James and Mike, both in their mid-20s. James had a history of criminal activity, having been convicted of theft and assault multiple times. Mike had a clean record, but he was known to be associated with James. The two men were charged with assault, battery, and robbery. The evidence presented against them was overwhelming, and they were found guilty. James was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Mike received 10 years. Jack was lucky to have survived the attack, but he was left traumatized. He suffered from anxiety and depression for several weeks after the incident. However, he was grateful for the police's prompt response and for the fact that justice had been served. In the end, Jack learned a valuable lesson. He learned that it's essential to be cautious when dealing with strangers, especially when it involves meeting them in person. He also learned that it's important to fight back when faced with danger and to never give up. Jack's experience is a reminder to all of us that safety should always be a top priority, and we should never compromise it for anything. As for James and Mike, they are serving their sentences in prison. James has a history of violent behavior, having grown up in a dysfunctional family. His father was an alcoholic, and his mother was abusive. He dropped out of high school and turned to a life of crime. Mike, on the other hand, was raised in a loving family and had no criminal history before he met James. However, he was easily influenced and fell into a life of crime. The two men's paths crossed, and they became partners in crime. My opinion. This story shows the destructive influence of our environment on us. By the example of Mike, we understand that if it were not for the bad criminal environment, he would have grown up to be a good man. But he took a completely different path. It was a bright sunny day in California in the year 2017. A young man, Jake, was looking to buy an iPhone through Craigslist. He made an appointment with a salesman and agreed to meet him at a nearby coffee shop. Little did he know that this was going to be a life-changing event. As Jake arrived at the coffee shop, he saw the salesman waiting for him. He approached him and greeted him, but as soon as he took out the money to pay for the iPhone, the salesman attacked him. He hit Jake on the head with a metal rod and tried to steal his money. Jake was in shock, but he didn't give up. He fought back and managed to escape. Bleeding and disoriented, he ran to the nearest police station and reported the incident. The police took Jake's statement and started their investigation. They searched the area and managed to find some clues. They looked through the surveillance footage and found the face of the perpetrator. They identified him as Michael, a man with a long criminal history. The police tracked down Michael's location and arrested him. They searched his house and found the stolen money and the metal rod used to attack Jake. Michael was charged with robbery and assault, and he was sent to jail. Jake's life was never the same after that incident. He suffered from PTSD and was afraid to trust anyone. He started going to therapy and slowly started to heal. He realized that life is unpredictable and he needed to be more careful. As for Michael, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail for his crime. In jail, he realized the gravity of his actions and regretted what he had done. He started attending therapy and rehabilitation programs and decided to turn his life around. Michael was born in California in 1985. He grew up in a poor neighborhood and was surrounded by crime and violence. His parents were drug addicts, and they didn't provide him with the love and support he needed. Michael was left to fend for himself and learn to survive on the streets. As he got older, Michael started getting involved in petty crimes. He stole from local stores and sold drugs to make money. He soon became addicted to drugs himself and started using them regularly. Michael's criminal activities escalated, and he started robbing people at gunpoint. He didn't care about the consequences of his actions and was always looking for a quick buck. The incident with Jake was a turning point for Michael. He realized that his actions were not only hurting other people, but they were also ruining his life. He decided to take responsibility for his actions and change his ways. My opinion, the story highlights the importance of being cautious and vigilant while dealing with strangers, especially when it comes to online transactions. It also shows the consequences of criminal behavior and the possibility of rehabilitation and change. It was a beautiful summer day in Texas, and 25-year-old Sarah was looking forward to her new electric bike. She had been saving up for weeks and finally found the perfect one on Craigslist. Sarah made an appointment to meet the vendor at a local park, excited to finally get her hands on the bike. As Sarah arrived at the meeting place, she looked around for the vendor but couldn't see him. Suddenly, she heard footsteps coming from behind her. She turned around to see a man walking towards her. The man was wearing a hoodie, sunglasses, and had a nervous look on his face. "Are you the vendor?" Sarah asked him. "Yes, I am," the man replied, pulling out a piece of paper with the bike's details on it. Sarah was about to ask him where the bike was when the man grabbed her by the arm and pulled out a knife. Sarah screamed for help, but the man quickly silenced her by covering her mouth with his hand. "Shut up, or I'll kill you," he whispered. The man dragged Sarah into the woods nearby and brutally assaulted her. After he was done, he left her lying there unconscious, bleeding, and barely alive. Thankfully, a jogger stumbled upon Sarah and immediately called 911. An ambulance rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. Sarah had already passed away due to the severity of her injuries. The police immediately launched an investigation into Sarah's death. They traced the vendor's phone number and managed to locate him a few days later. His name was Michael, a 30-year-old man with a long criminal record. Michael had been convicted of assault and battery in the past and had just been released from prison a few months prior. The police interrogated Michael, and he eventually confessed to killing Sarah. He explained that he had been desperate for money and had planned to rob Sarah, but things had gotten out of hand. Michael was charged with murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Sarah's family finally got the justice they deserved, but they would never be able to get over the loss of their beloved daughter. In the years that followed, Michael's story made headlines across the country. People were shocked by the brutality of his crime, and many wondered how someone could be capable of such evil. Some speculated that Michael's troubled childhood and criminal history had contributed to his actions, while others argued that he was simply a monster who deserved to rot in jail. Despite the debates, one thing was clear: Sarah's death had left a permanent scar on the community. Her family and friends would never forget her, and her tragic story would serve as a cautionary tale for years to come. My opinion: this story is a reminder that we should always be cautious when meeting strangers, especially when conducting business through online platforms. It is also a lesson on the importance of being aware of our surroundings and trusting our instincts. Lastly, it highlights the need for our justice system to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions, to bring closure to victims' families, and ensure that justice is served. In the summer of 2021, in Colorado, a man made an appointment with a car salesman to buy a car through Craigslist. Little did he know that he was about to become the victim of a violent robbery. The man arrived at the meeting place, only to be attacked by the salesman and several other partners. The robbers stole his money, broke several of his limbs, and left him lying helpless on the ground. The victim was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent surgery to save his life. The perpetrator of this heinous crime was a man named Michael Johnson. Johnson was born and raised in Colorado, but had a troubled upbringing. His parents were drug addicts, and he was frequently left to fend for himself. As a result, he turned to a life of crime at an early age, and quickly became involved in gangs and other criminal activities. Johnson was known to be a violent and dangerous individual, and had a long history of criminal activity. He had been arrested numerous times for robbery, assault, and other violent crimes. Despite his criminal record, he had managed to avoid serious jail time, thanks in part to his ability to manipulate the legal system. On the day of the crime, Johnson and several accomplices had planned to rob the victim, who they believed would be carrying a large amount of cash. They had arranged a meeting through Craigslist, posing as car salesmen in order to lure the victim to a secluded location. When the victim arrived, Johnson and his partners attacked him, using weapons to break his limbs and steal his money. They then fled the scene, leaving the victim lying on the ground in agony. The victim was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent surgery to repair his broken limbs. Miraculously, he survived the attack, but was left with permanent injuries and emotional trauma. Meanwhile, the police launched an investigation into the crime, and were eventually able to track down and arrest Johnson and his accomplices. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and they were quickly convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. In the years since the crime, the victim has struggled to come to terms with what happened to him. He has undergone numerous surgeries and physical therapy sessions, but still experiences pain and discomfort on a daily basis. Despite this, he has refused to let the experience define him and has worked hard to rebuild his life. The story of Michael Johnson and his accomplices serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of violent crime. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a warning to others to be vigilant and aware of their surroundings. While justice has been served in this case, the victim and his family will continue to bear the scars of this crime for the rest of their lives. It is a tragic reminder that the actions of a few can have a profound impact on the lives of many. My opinion: this story shows that not all people wish you well. Through the example of the victim, we can see that an ordinary day can turn into a real ordeal at the cost of a lifetime. That's why you should always be on your guard, especially around strangers. In 2018 in Nevada, a heinous crime took place that left one man seriously injured and traumatized. It all started when a man made an appointment with a vendor to buy a gaming laptop through Craigslist. Little did he know, this simple transaction would turn into a nightmare that he would never forget. The man who orchestrated this crime was named James. James had a rough upbringing and had been in and out of trouble with the law since he was a teenager. He had a history of violence and had served time in jail for assault and robbery. Despite his troubled past, James was determined to make quick money and live a luxurious lifestyle. James had posted an advertisement on Craigslist advertising a gaming laptop for sale. The victim, whom we will call John, responded to the ad and arranged to meet James at his house. When John arrived, he was met by James and two of his accomplices, who immediately attacked him. John was brutally beaten and then held hostage until he paid James and his associates $20,000. John was left traumatized and seriously injured after the attack. He was rushed to the hospital, where he received medical treatment for his injuries. Meanwhile, the police launched an investigation into the crime and were able to track down James and his accomplices. They were all arrested and charged with kidnapping, assault, and robbery. James and his accomplices were put on trial, and John testified against them. It was a long and emotional trial, but in the end, justice was served. James was found guilty of all charges and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. His accomplices were also found guilty and were given prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. John eventually recovered from his injuries, but was left with emotional scars that would never fully heal. He struggled with anxiety and PTSD for years after the attack. James, on the other hand, spent the next 25 years of his life behind bars, paying for his crimes. The incident served as a reminder of the dangers of online transactions and the importance of being cautious when dealing with strangers. It was a harrowing experience for all involved, but justice prevailed in the end. My opinion: the story above serves as a reminder of the dangers of online transactions and the importance of being cautious when dealing with strangers. It also highlights the consequences of criminal behavior and the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions.